Hey, what's up? It's Wanda Sykes. I'm here to remind you about something super important, getting your breast screened. Because trust me, your breast health should be a priority. Early detection for breast cancer can change the game, which is why you should visit yourattentionplease.com to learn more. And do me a favor, if you've already had a breast cancer screening, remind your friends and family to visit yourattentionplease.com too. We gotta look out for our girls.
You've maxed out your 401k, you're contributing to an IRA, and making some other investments. You're ahead of the game and doing well. But where do you go from here? The same old story can only get you so far. If you want a new take from a new type of financial professional, we invite you to get a fresh perspective beside an agent with the backing of New York Life. Insurance, investments, retirement, and more. Visit nyl.com to learn more. Investments are offered through registered representatives of NyLife Securities, LLC, member FINRA SIPC, a New York Life company.
I hear a car pull up and I peek out and it was like a nice car, a Cadillac. And this man gets out and he looks familiar. I had the same kind of thought, but I didn't remember this was the man I'd seen. I just thought, well, this is somebody who looks familiar. And like I said, he's the kindest, warmest, most wonderful person. My mom introduces me to him and he takes us out to this nice steakhouse. If we go out to dinner, it's fast food. If we sit down, it's Denny's. I don't know what to order. You know, he orders prime rib for me. He's like, do you like prime rib? I'm like, I have no idea. We would drink water. He orders me a Shirley Temple. And then he's just keeps coming around. And he starts coming to my softball games. And he's just this warm, kind presence in our lives. And he's just present for all of us for years. What was I then? 14, 15, maybe? And so that was another thought I had there sitting in the car. All this time, he has been enjoying being present in his daughter's life. And I have seen him as another in a long line of substitute dads.
Welcome to DNA Surprises, a podcast that delves into the world of unexpected DNA discoveries. I'm your host, Alexis Auersalt. In July 2021, my life took a surprising turn when I found out that I'm an NPE, a person who has experienced a non-paternal event. In other words, my biological father isn't who I thought he was. Join me as we explore the stories of NPEs, adoptees, and donor-conceived people and their families. Get ready to unravel the astonishing journeys that begin with a simple DNA test. This is DNA Surprises. If you've had a DNA surprise, how many times have you been told that you should write a book? This week's episode is a story that is truly stranger than fiction. Traci shares how, at 19, her mother revealed the truth about her paternity. This truth sent Traci reeling, but her mother insisted that she always knew it. Her mom went on to explain the events that led them to that moment. It's a story straight out of a true crime novel, and Traci didn't remember any of it. Traci goes on to share what happened after the revelation, including how she moved forward with her parents, who married just a few years after her DNA surprise. Thank you, Traci, for sharing your story.
My name is Traci. I'm 56 and I'm from Seattle, Washington. My DNA surprise story started when I was almost 19, so just a couple weeks before I was 19 years old. And there was so much excitement going on that time. It was a couple of weeks before I was getting married. And also my brother was preparing for the trials to be on the World Wrestling team, the World USA Wrestling team. So there was a ton to be excited about in our family, which is really relevant because it kind of masked that my mom was just a little bit off and distracted, which is unlike her. She has always been so vested in everything all of us were doing. So the wrestling trials were over Memorial Day weekend in the San Francisco Bay Area. And so all of, like my birthday and the wedding and everything was the end of June. But my mom and I were taking a road trip down to watch my brother in these wrestling trials. which was very exciting. And I hadn't seen him in almost a year, which I never went that long without seeing him. Even when he lived in Europe, we we're just really, really close. I just would show up at his house wherever he lived all over the world. And so I was super excited to see him. And this road trip started off, and somewhere along the way, kind of right on the Oregon-California border, my mom started up, like really intentionally started up this conversation about being really remorseful that my dad wasn't going to be at the wedding. And she, was trying to reassure me this was going to be okay, which seemed really out of the blue because I hadn't had any communication with my dad in over 6 or 7 years at that point. So there was zero expectation on my part that he would be at my wedding. It was just not even on the radar at all. So I'm like, why are you bringing this up? That seems so bizarre.
And how did he kind of leave your life, 6 to 7 years earlier?
He left our lives when we were much younger. It was probably when I was 6 or 7, he moved to Alaska. And he was remarried. So his wife and, we had step siblings, but they lived in Alaska. So we rarely saw him. We, meaning my 2 older siblings, and I went to Alaska for the whole month of July when I was 9 to visit them. And then that was really the last contact we had with him. That was a really awful trip. And then he came back one time, I remember when I was 12. He would just show up out of the blue. We never had any idea that he was coming. And then he came to my brother's wedding, but bizarrely, we didn't know he was going to come. He stood in the back, and, you just only remember things through your own lens. But I remember he just awkwardly said hi to me, like he kind of shook my hand as a 12-year-old, just like, okay, but I mean, that's my dad, but I hadn't seen him then in 3 years. And that was the last time that I had had any communication with him at all.
Okay.
My sister, who's between my brother and me in age, had moved to Alaska to live with him in the middle of high school. And she only stayed in his home for like 6 weeks before he kicked her out and she went to live with someone else. So he was just not a great dad ever. So it was really bizarre for my mom to bring this up, like I was somehow heartbroken and had these secret dreams that he would show up. It just wasn't a part of it at all for me. And she'd said, I just don't want you to feel like there's this dark cloud over your wedding because your dad's not going to be there. And I'm like, there's just not. Like, I just didn't have that expectation. And she'd said, but Marco is going to be there. Now, Marco was just like a lifelong family friend, someone we'd kind of known. Like, I didn't even know why, but we'd just always known this person. And then my mom started dating him when I was 16, and we all just love him. He's amazing. And so he was going to be there. He was going to just kind of stand in, and it was really fantastic. And so I'm like, yeah, I know all of this. Like, this is so crazy. Why are you forcing this conversation? Mm-hmm. And I was like, yeah, I know. I appreciate that. It's great. And she waited, like I was going to add something to this conversation. And she said, well, you need to know that my dad, the person who I believe is my dad, you need to know he's not your father. Marco is. And I was like, stunned.
Wow.
I couldn't really breathe. I couldn't hear her anymore. It was just almost like on, Charlie Brown, like there was this voice continuing to talk, but I was just not able to even take in what she was saying. And I was having a hard time breathing or just staring out the windshield, just like, what? What did she just say to me?
This was a total surprise. Had you ever suspected or even wished that Marco was your biological father?
Never. I mean, I had no idea. This was the most far-fetched thing that I could have ever, it just never crossed my mind. And she was looking at me like, why are you behaving so bizarrely? Like, you knew this. I did not know this. I don't know. What? Why do you think? I absolutely do not know this. And she was just like, oh, come on, you're being so dramatic. And then that kind of snapped me back into the conversation, that I became so angry that she was just like, oh, please. Like, I do not know this. I have never known this. Why do you think I know this? She's like, you knew this until you were 5. You knew this every day of your life until you were 5. We just thought you didn't want to talk about it. I'm like, if that's true, you let a 5-year-old decide that she just didn't want to talk about it for the last 13 years? You let a child make that decision? I was just utterly beside myself. I couldn't even come up with the questions. They were coming to my mind so fast, I couldn't get them out of my mouth. How did I come to believe that, my brother and sister's dad is my dad? I've seen my birth certificate. His name is on my birth certificate. So what's the story? Like, what happened? You need to start from absolute beginning, because I don't know any of this. So she starts from the beginning, that she was married and had my brother and sister, and then she and her husband separated. And she went to work for my dad, who was married and had 2 kids. And then eventually they started a relationship. She became pregnant with me, which ended her marriage to my brother and sister dad, because they were separated. But when she became pregnant with me, it became clear that this marriage is officially and formally and finally over. But my dad didn't leave his family. He stayed married and had his 2 kids, and she continued working for him, and they had me. And I just started going to work with her every day. So my dad owned 2 taverns, and she was his bookkeeper, and she brought me to work there during the day when they weren't open, because way back then taverns weren't open during the day.
Right.
And I just grew up, from infancy to toddlerhood until I was 5, seeing him every day and knowing him as my dad. During that early time, when my mom was working for him and I was little, he was working with a very good friend of his, who was the chief of police in the town, who was trying to catch some corrupt police officers who were involved in a drug ring. And he thought, maybe this might be going on in your establishment. They won't realize that you're watching for me if you could just keep your eye out. And sure enough, my dad saw this going on and told his friend at the police department, and those 4 officers were arrested and stood trial and were convicted. And they knew that it was my dad who was the source of that information. So even from prison, they were watching and waiting for some opportunity to retaliate. And so when I was 5, my mom kind of got tired of waiting around for him to leave his wife and leave his family and all the things that she was being told, those empty promises.
Did his wife and family know about their relationship and you?
It's unclear to me if his wife knew. I have an inkling that she probably had some idea. I know that his brother knew because he was a part of their business, but the rest of his family had no idea. To this day, some of his family don't know that I exist.
Okay.
When I was 5, my mom ended that relationship. She quit working for him. She got a different job. And in the same window of time, maybe in the same month's time, his mother passed away. His mother, who he was maybe too close to and extremely protective of. So in the same month, he'd lost my mom, he'd lost contact with me, and he'd lost his mother. And he had what then they would have called like a nervous breakdown. And so these officers from prison had people watching for an opportunity to retaliate. And they said, now's the time. Now that he's just not really very stable. My mom had met someone new at her new job who would later become my stepdad. And they hired someone to go to my dad and say, this new man in their lives is abusing your daughter. And this man offered to kill him. They said, I will kill him for you. And my dad, not in his right mind, said, yes, I will hire you to do that. So he provided a gun and he provided the money. But what he did is he got $1,000 and he tore each of the bills in half. And it's like, here's half, and you can have the other half when it's carried out. So because behind all of this were police officers, they were able to tip off the police through all these back channels that my dad had hired a hitman to kill my stepdad. So the police came to us. They informed my parents that this was happening. And this I remember. They took us into police custody. They hid us away for several days. I don't remember because now I'm 5, right? So maybe 3, maybe 4 days. We had to stay in this really, really lousy hotel. We couldn't even open the curtains. And then my father was arrested and he was held in jail where he was beaten and mercifully, he told me later, because the police, again, were exacting revenge. And he didn't have money for bail, so he had to stay in jail for months and months until his trial, where he was tried for attempted murder, but he was found innocent by reason of entrapment because the crime was conceived of in the mind of the police. But that is when all contact with me and with my mom was severed because, as you can imagine, my stepdad did not want him coming around. He underwent a lot of psychological care. He was not well. As I spent a lot of time processing and looking back over, I knew this, thinking through, should I have ever figured that out? There were times, because we still lived in the same town. He lived about 20 minutes away from us. There were 2 times that we accidentally ran into him, just out and about. One time in particular when I was 8 and I had fallen down ice skating and I had cut my chin open and I needed stitches. But, just a minor surface cut on your chin bleeds like crazy.
Yeah.
So my shirt and my jeans were covered in blood. My mom had taken me to the emergency room and I had stitches, but I had a bandage from eyebrow under my chin up to eyebrow and I'm covered in blood. And I talked her into taking me to Dairy Queen to get some ice cream because I had undergone this traumatic event of getting stitches. And he was in that Dairy Queen with his older 2 children on this Friday night. And we walk in and he hasn't seen me now in 3 years. And I'm show up with this huge bandage covered in blood. And I have this distinct memory of this man just like clearing the way, pushing people out of the way to get to us. Like, what happened to her? Is she okay? And I thought it was so cool that I had this big bandage and I'm covered in blood and I wanted to go in and make sure everybody saw me for all the attention.
Get attention, yeah.
And I made my mom promise, like, we can get ice cream and we can go in and we can eat it there, right? And she's like, yes. Oh my gosh, this is ridiculous. But when he saw us and came across the restroom, instantly we had to go. We couldn't get ice cream. We couldn't stay. It's too late. And we left. And I was miffed, 8-year-old me is like, what the heck? You promised, like, you said we could get ice cream. But only in looking back at it, I was like, oh, that makes sense. But at the time, I just thought, well, he looks familiar. And why do we have to go? But it just didn't register. I didn't recognize him other than he looks familiar. My mind, I think, just protected me from all of that.
I think I just won my taxes.
Yeah?
I just switched to H&R Block in about 1 minute. All I had to do was drag and drop last year's return into H&R Block, and bam, my information is automatically there.
So I don't have to go digging around for all my old papers to switch?
Nope.
Sounds like we just leveled up our tax game.
Switching to H&R Block is easy. Just drag and drop your last return. It's better with Block.
Take your plans out of the group chat and get long weekend ready in new Abercrombie. From day to night, pack new outfits for every part of your itinerary. Grabbing brunch? Throw on the A&F Mila dress. Then head to your dinner reservation in their new bubble hem mini dress. And yes, permission to overpack for pics with the girls. Abercrombie's best-selling Scarlet Squirt deserves a post in your feed. Your plans are worth it. Shop Abercrombie's new long weekend collection online or in store.
At some point, he re-enters your life And how does, this is stranger than fiction. So he goes from spending time in jail for attempted murder against your stepfather. All this time from, 1 to 5, that he's your biological father, according to your mother.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Obviously, that is a very traumatic series of events that happens to you. And at some point, you forget that he's your biological father.
Yeah.
And then 14 years later, he's brought up again. He's going to be at your wedding.
He's back. Yeah, he's back. My mom and stepdad divorced when I was about 13. And then shortly thereafter, my sister had moved to Alaska. My brother graduated and went off to college and then joined the Army. And it was just me and my mom at home. And, we were just having a great time, just the two of us. And then I remember coming home from softball practice. And my mom said, you have to get dressed quickly. We're leaving. We just got home. She's like, well, a friend of mine is coming to take us out to dinner. Like, my mom didn't date. She wasn't a dater. She was dedicated to us, really. And now she was dedicated to me. Really, she was just at everything I did. When she wasn't working, she was there. And it was the most unusual thing in the world. Like, what? I mean, we didn't go out either. I mean, my mom was a single mom working really hard, but she worked in a grocery store. So we didn't have a lot of extra. We had everything we needed, but not a lot extra. And so we didn't go out to eat. And so I'm in my room trying to get dressed. I hear a car pull up and I peek out, and it was like a nice car, a Cadillac. And this man gets out, and I think, we're going out to eat with a man? Like, what? And he looks familiar. I had the same kind of thought, but I didn't remember this was the man I'd seen. I just thought, well, this is somebody who looks familiar. And like I said, he's the kindest, warmest, most wonderful person. My mom introduces me to him, and he takes us out to this nice steakhouse. If we go out to dinner, it's fast food. If we sit down, it's Denny's. I don't know what to order. He orders prime rib for me. He's like, do you like prime rib? I'm like, I have no idea. We would drink water. He orders me a Shirley Temple, and then he's just keeps coming around. And he starts coming to my softball games, and he's just this warm, kind presence in our lives. And he's just present for all of us for years. What was I then? 14, 15, maybe? And so that was another thought I had there sitting in the car. All this time, he has been enjoying being present in his daughter's life. And I have seen him as another in a long line of substitute dads. For example, when I was a senior in high school, I was elected to be homecoming queen, which is a great honor that I did not want, because I was the only person of all of the freshmen and the sophomores and the juniors and the people in my class, the guys and the girls who didn't have their parent there with them. I was the only one with a substitute dad. And just standing there in the line, I was just embarrassed, and I was just like, I always have a substitute dad.
Was he there? Was it
He
him?
was there with me. He was there with me to escort me.
Oh.
And he knew that he was there to escort his daughter. But I was embarrassed, and I had wished that my friend had won, because it was kind of between the two of us. And I was like, I just wish that this was her, because her dad had often been my substitute dad. Her dad taught me how to drive a stick shift and had done so many things that dads do for their kids. I had kind of confessed that to another friend. She's like, you don't even seem excited about this. I'm like, to be honest, I wish this was you or one of the other people, because you don't know how bad it feels because you have your dad. She's like, are you kidding? You have Marco. I'm like, he's fantastic. But it's not the same. I would just rather cheer for you. So those kinds of things were just hurtful looking back on.
Do you think that your mom believed that you knew this? Or do you think that she believed that you didn't know that Marco was your dad? I mean, I know once kind of confronted, she's like, of course you knew, but Do you think she knew?
I really think she thought somewhere inside of me I did, because she would never willingly hurt me. She just wouldn't. That's not who she is. It's not the mom she's ever been. And I think she thought she was always doing what was best for me. She said, I just never found a time that seemed right, that wouldn't be so disruptive to an adolescent's life. I always thought, maybe now, why don't, she's doing so well. I don't want to disrupt her life. I don't want to cause her any trouble.
So she didn't want to like check in and say, you know this, right? You do know this.
Yeah.
When you had this conversation in the car, she just told you everything about the whole hitman jail story. That is so much to take in.
Which, of course, as a 5-year-old, I didn't know about. I think, well, they sorted everything out. And then we just went on with our lives. There was a lot that happened in our lives that, of course, having this person who I thought was my dad, who was not a great dad, who was always absent and always away. He was an alcoholic. So that was developed in me and my siblings, a lot of coping mechanisms that children of alcoholics develop, of trying to please and trying to be very good, trying to do everything you can to make sure that you're the one who's keeping the peace. And all of those coping mechanisms were still very much intact because my stepfather was also an alcoholic. And living in the home with him really reinforced all of those coping mechanisms. And I would be remiss if I didn't say that at that same time, right around 5 years old, is when I went to church with my neighbors and I came to my own Christian faith that was such an anchor to me throughout this. Because I just found a way to always like take a bus. This church had a bus to Sunday school. And when that stopped, there was a bus to Awana. And without that faith, I really don't know how I would have survived all of that turmoil, because it was such an anchor to be able to tell myself I am loved no matter what. With who I thought was my dad in Alaska being so particularly mean to me, like that trip to Alaska, because he knew I wasn't his. And for some reason, he went along with this charade. He agreed to having my name put on his birth certificate. My mom said, in fact, it was his idea, because one day when he was picking up and dropping off my older brother and sister, he's like, what are you going to do with this third child? I mean, clearly you're on your own. And she said, I don't know. And he said, you know what you should do is you should just give that child my name. You have 3 kids. They're all the same. So one isn't being raised differently. And she thought, you know what, you're right. And so she did that. That's where the idea came from, to put his name on my birth certificate. And he went along with it. I don't know how I came to believe he was my dad. I mean, just one time he came to pick up my brother and sister. I was like, can I go? Can I come along? And they're all like, sure, what's one more,
Yeah. I mean, you were so young. You were so young, and memory is just weird anyway when you're that age, and then you believe what you want to believe, and
you do.
If nobody tells you any different, it's easy to kind of make up a story and stick with it.
Yeah.
Wow.
And I asked my mom, like, why would you send me to Alaska for a month to be with people who are not my parents? And she said, it was never my intention that you would go. You were so young. I thought we would get there, we would get to the airport, and you'd be like, no, I don't want to go. And I would say, okay, you don't have to. And I'd bring you back home with me. Again, you left this to a child, such happenstance.
Yeah.
But when we got to the airport, you were so excited. You jumped on that plane. And I thought, well, she always loves to go. Like, I never really let her know until recently when I wrote about all of this. She didn't really know what I endured there, which isn't entirely fair to her because, like I said, she would never intentionally hurt me. So our birthdays, my brother's birthday is 8 days before mine, and my sister's birthday is 10 days after mine. So it's like this little festival of birthdays. Mm-hmm. And we arrived there on my birthday. And when we got to their tiny little home, there was a birthday party set up. There were decorations, there was a cake. And being 9, I assumed like, this is my birthday party. And it was for my brother. I mean, only his name was on the cake and there was only a gift for him. And then naively, I was like, hey, it's my birthday today. And they made it very clear, like, we know and we don't care. You don't get a birthday, which was devastating. And then 10 days later, the same thing for my sister, a huge birthday party, and they got her ears pierced for her. And then my stepmom, who was particularly cruel, decided, we're going to tell the stories of when everyone was born. My dad, or, then who I thought was my dad, started with the story of my brother's birth, which was very dramatic. He was almost 11 pounds and my mom was in intensive care. And it was, just very dramatic story. And then my sister, like, well, tell me about me when I was born. He's like, well, I got to go in the delivery room by then and I got to see you be born. And it was amazing to see you come like right when you were born and the first breath of life and all these details. And then he was done telling the stories. And I said, well, wait, what about when I was born? Tell me about when I was born. And he looked at me, he said, I didn't know you were born for 3 weeks and I didn't care.
Oh
and
my gosh.
Just devastated because I thought that was my dad.
I'm so sorry. So you go 10 years from that point. I mean, he was already not really involved in your life anyway, but you go 10 years from that moment to learning that he wasn't your father at all. So 10 years of feeling really rejected.
Yeah.
And wow.
That night, I mean, I was like, you cannot let him see you cry. You cannot let him know. But that night I crawled in bed with my brother and I was just like, I don't understand. I'm trying to be so good, but I can't be good enough. And I had changed the words to Jesus loves me in my mind. It was like, Jesus loves me, this I know. And why you hate me, I don't know, but Jesus loves me, this I know. And I just, that bedrock knowledge that I was still loved just sustained me. But we still had 3 weeks before I could go back home. It was tough. So going back through all of those kinds of things and realizing everyone else knew this. My older siblings knew this.
That's what I was going to ask, is did your siblings know?
They were still kids themselves. But as they got older, they knew and they were aware that they should keep the secret. And as I came to realize that my cousins knew, they would hear a conversation, they would pick up on something that adults were saying because I wasn't there. And they were made known, like, you cannot tell. Obviously, my aunts and uncles knew, my grandparents knew. It dawned on me, the more I processed this, most everyone knows this and has kept this secret. And that sense of betrayal just continued to gut me. The more I realized, the more I came across, it's like, wow.
You have this conversation with your mom. She tells you this. You find out everything. Do you talk to Marco after this conversation?
I really kind of sat in stunned silence after that was a long conversation where, and I was so mad. I'm like, you trapped me in this car. I need to get away. Like, I feel so trapped. And my brother competed in this competition. To be honest, I have no idea if he won or lost. And it wasn't until after he was done that I was able to talk to him. And he's always been a safe harbor for me. And he was like, listen, I know this is really, really hard, but living our entire lives all day, every day, like sleeping in the backyard, teaching you where's the Big Dipper and where's the Little Dipper and teaching you how to juggle a soccer ball. All of those things are what make you my sister, and nothing can ever change that. And I was like, I know that's true, but this is going to take me a minute. Like, I am knocked on my butt right now. But the thing is, all of those shove it down, put on a smile, please everyone else, coping skills kicked in. And when I came home, my fiance was waiting in the driveway because we had to get off to this like pre-marriage thing you had to do at the church. And We had only a few weeks left, everything to do. And he had all these ideas. I thought about this, with this. And I was just like, I cannot get married. We got to cancel this whole thing. I don't know who I am. I got to rethink my whole life. This is no way to start. And he was just like as stunned as I was. Like, this is what my mom just told me. And he was like, what? But no, time out. You can't cancel the wedding. I'm like, really? This is nonsense. Just to try to start off a marriage like this. I mean, I am absolutely upside down. And he's like, no, I'm not going to let you do that. I understand. Like, but like, no, I'm sorry. And I had finals. I was in college. I had finals to face. I went back to school. He came and found me the next day. I just was sitting, I went to the University of Washington. I was sitting on the Montlake Cut where the yachts go by and just sitting there early in the morning. And I was just like praying, like, I'm so lost. I don't know what to do. I mean, I don't feel like asking like why. I hate those kinds of questions. Like, it's why not? I mean, lots of terrible things happen in this world. I've experienced a lot of them, but I don't know what to do. I don't know how much time went by, but my then fiance, now husband, walks up and sits down beside me. He's like, do you know how many places I've looked? I've looked all the places. This was the last one. Like, I don't know where she is. And he just sat there and he's like, we can call this off. Like, I understand. Like, you must be beside yourself. So I'm not going to try to talk you out of that. Or we could just still get married and figure this out together. It's not really going to change that I'm still going to help you figure this out. And he was just like in tears. And I thought, now I'm just hurting more people. I don't want to do that. So I don't know if that was a wise decision because there was so much fallout that he bore the brunt of, because what I did to my family is what I always did. Just put on a smile. I'll be the compliant one who doesn't ever cause any trouble. And it was really, really awkward. The first time I saw Marco, when I saw my dad, I could tell he was he was so relieved and just so happy. And I just felt awful. But I was trying to make him feel better about it. We got married, we went away on our honeymoon, we came back, and it was just like, well, that's behind us. And I just kind of kept pushing down all those terrible feelings until my doctor thought I had an ulcer. Like, my stomach hurt so bad. Within a year, they were putting like a scope down my throat to look and see what's going on with the inside of your stomach lining. And I finally had to like start writing about this and processing it, but just for myself. And never really addressed it with my parents because I finally had parents. Yeah. And I didn't want to disrupt that in any way. And then a few years later, my parents married each other. And I really had parents. I had a family.
Were you happy? How did you feel?
I was, because it was just like I could talk to anyone and I could say, oh, well, my parents are going to come over. And they were my parents. I was still processing so much. And I would shock myself sometimes by the things that would kind of explode out of me. I was like, who was that? Because there was a lot shoved down in. And my husband helped a lot, or he saw what was seeping out.
What was coming up? Was it feelings around the betrayal, the lie, the not knowing? What was bringing up kind of negative, quote unquote, emotions for you?
Mostly, I would get really angry, and I'm just not an angry person. And I thought, what is that? What's going on with me? Because that's just not me. I would say I did a really good job of shoving this all down and putting a big smile on my face and marching forward and being so happy to have parents who are married to each other. And then when I was 25, my son was born, and he almost bled to death from his circumcision because he has hemophilia, which means his blood doesn't clot. And that runs in families, or there are a certain percentage of people who it's just a brand new spontaneous mutation is what they call it. And so when they diagnosed him and they started to get him stabilized, and he had to spend an extra week in the hospital to get him stabilized, and they started doing a lot of genetic testing to find where this comes from, because it is a disease that only males have, but females carry it because it's on the X chromosome. And so when all of that testing came back, it took about 5 months, I think, for all of the testing to come back. What they told me was, this mutation came from your dad. So the X, you got one X from your mom, you got one X from your dad. And the X that came from your dad is healthy in him. He doesn't have hemophilia. But at your conception, it mutated. And so you carry the disease. And that is the X that you gave to your son. And that was the most devastating news that I received in my entire life, I think. Not that he had it. I mean, that was upsetting because, well, one, he almost died, and learning about what that would mean for his life. And he's actually gone on to live a miraculously healthy life. But learning that, I was conceived of in this illicit relationship that was covered over with a lie. And it was almost like right down to my DNA. There was something wrong about me. There was something broken about me. And it's all the way down to my very DNA. And then it was passed on to my completely innocent child. And there was nothing I could do about it. It was so dark for me to feel that way about myself. And it was the most challenging time to work through that and to press into my faith and to press into, these are not things I have control over. And these are things I have to trust that there is a plan that will work out. And seeing, like 31 years later, that my son's health has been protected so beautifully, and that maybe this story encourages someone else, and that there is a purpose for it, and that I have been protected and cared for through the struggle and through the suffering is really, really comforting, but you can kind of only see that in hindsight.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I mean, we hear so many times on the podcast about how important that medical history is. And for a lot of us, it's around the unknown or kind of minor medical concerns, but this was life or death, for your son. And for you to be able to get those answers, I'm sure was such a relief, and to know where it came from and everything. So thank you for sharing that.
That was one thing I was very thankful for as we sat in the hospital and the doctor said, we're going to need to do genetic testing. I thought, I'm so glad this is not when I'm finding this out. That would have been way too much all at once.
Yeah. Oh, gosh. Yeah, with everyone knowing too.
My dad would talk to me about his family, his brother, his sister. They're Greek. They're first-generation Greek immigrants. And their Greek community is this very tight-knit community. And I was starting to see his older two kids, my half-siblings, and I wasn't sure what they thought of me, how they were going to treat me. And my half-sister has always been very kind and very warm. And my half-brother has always been polite, but very aloof. I don't know what he's thought. I think he was particularly angry with our dad, but he felt very lied to as well. But like I said, some of my dad's family still didn't know that I existed. Or if they did, they didn't want to acknowledge my existence, because if you're not 100% Greek, you're not acceptable, especially coming from this relationship, this illicit affair. And so he would see his family, but I was never introduced to them, to the extent like they were married. My dad passed away in May of 2022. So they were married for over 30 years when my dad passed away. And at the end of his life, when he was in a hospital bed in their living room. My mom was caring for him and he couldn't be left alone. And I went over to visit him and I opened the door and just walked in like I always do. And this man sitting on the couch stood up and I startled him and I expected my mom there. And he said, "Oh, hello, I'm Evan. I'm Marco's nephew." And then I knew his name and I knew who he was because I'd heard so much about him from my dad, but I'd not met him. And I said, "Oh, I'm Traci. I'm Marco's daughter," which is so awkward because he's my first cousin. And he was so embarrassed. He's like, "Oh, I'm so sorry." He just started stuttering. And I was like, "You know what? I'm going to let you have your visit because I know you're really close and I'll come back." And I just left.
How did that sort of rejection from that side of the family and your Greek heritage, that was sort of one of your ties to that, factor into your struggles with identity?
Well, interestingly, in 2019, two of my kids and I went, my dad's family is from this very tiny island, almost to Turkey. It's called Leros. And my dad would tell me about this island and his grandparents, my great-grandparents, as my great-grandfather was an Orthodox priest on the island. And he would tell me of this critical role. There was a really important World War II battle on this tiny little island. And I love history. And I think because he was a priest, my great-grandfather was a priest, and I'm a person of deep faith, and he was a teacher. And I think they were just safe people for my dad to tell me about because I shouldn't have known them. I shouldn't have had any access to them. Whereas I should have known his parents, but I didn't. And they never knew I even existed. And I should have known a lot of his family, but I don't know a lot of his family. So he would tell me a lot about them. And so I went there and I was trying to learn more about him. And I didn't really learn a lot while I was there. And I intended to go back, but then there was the pandemic. So I just got back 2 weeks ago. I intended to go I was like, I'm going there and I'm going to stay for 3 weeks because I think it's going to take that much time because I don't read Greek. I don't speak Greek. And I just want to learn as much as I can about my great-grandfather and this amazing story that my dad told me. He told me that this island was bombed for 52 straight days by the German army. It's only 9 miles long and 6 miles wide. So just complete devastation. My dad told me that my great-grandfather took all the Greek civilians into these caves during the bombing and basically saved them from the bombing. There were no civilian casualties. And then the German army won the battle, the ground battle eventually. And when they saw that all these Greek civilians were alive, they killed my great-grandparents. They dragged them through the streets behind tanks and they buried them alive in these caves to die. So it was this really interesting, amazing story.
Yeah.
And when I went there, I learned so much about him. I found these books and I talked to one person and said, "You should go talk to that person. You should go talk to that person." But nobody knew about this story. And I found all kinds of stuff about him. I was at the church administration building and the library and a historian and an artist, and just every single step led me to another step. It was an amazing adventure. And then finally, I was talking to one woman who works for an architect, and she said, "We work with some civil engineers with that same last name. It's a small place. They've got to know." So she just called them and she handed me the phone. I was like, oh my goodness. So I said, I'm here from Seattle, Washington, and I'm looking for information about my great-grandfather. His name was Papa Marcos Papa. And he said, "Well, that's my great-grandfather's name. Why don't you come to our office tonight at 8:00? Like, he's my second cousin."
Wow.
But the thing is, that story's not true.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. When your computer breaks, you don't wait for it to magically start working again. You fix the problem. So why wait to hire the people your company desperately needs? Use Indeed's sponsored jobs to hire top talent fast. And even better, you only pay for results. There's no need to wait. Speed up your hiring with a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. It's tax season, and we're all a bit tired of numbers. But here's one you need to hear. $16.5 billion. That's how much the IRS flagged for possible identity fraud last year. Now here's a good number. 100 million. That's how many data points LifeLock monitors every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it. Guaranteed. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
So I asked them about this story and the bombing and the caves. And he turned to his father, who doesn't speak English, and he said something in Greek. And the look on his father's face, he furrowed his brow and he frowned and he shook his head no. And he said something back in Greek. And his son said to me, that just didn't happen. Your great-grandparents, they died peacefully of old age at home before the war even happened. And I just had this sinking feeling in my stomach. I thought, why did you lie to me again? I felt so foolish. I think maybe that's the most common feeling that I've had throughout this is I just thought, I feel like such a fool. Why did I believe all these lies? Why didn't I figure it out? As I look back, there were so many clues. There were so many times when someone slipped up, when something didn't align, why was I such a fool to not figure it out? And I thought, I have been here for 3 weeks. And do you know how many people I have told this story to who must be going, that didn't happen. But mostly, my instant thought was relief. I thought, I'm so glad they did not have a violent end. And then I thought, but look at me, just believing this again. These people on this island were so wonderful. They instantly welcomed us. Our last night there, my husband joined me for the last 10 days because he wasn't up for 3 weeks of research, sitting in the library with Google Translate on books. But they all came, everyone on the island. So 2 young men who translated, both named after their grandfather. This is a Greek tradition. You name your kids after your parents. My great-grandparents had 7 kids, and one of them has 4 boys, and 3 of them and their wives and their kids all came to this dinner they had for us. And they welcomed me with just warmth and open arms and curiosity. It was so, so wonderful. And I said to my husband, here on this island, I have never felt more at home. It was great. The first time we went, my daughter and I were just at a town square and we watched some people just Greek dancing. And we stood there for so long watching. And my daughter was like, you're seeing the culture you didn't get to be a part of. We went to cooking classes and all those things that make up, a cultural identity. I met up with this woman who I'd met the first time there. And she's like, I'm sorry, I've got to go. I'm going to my Greek dance lessons. She goes, would you like to come? I would love to come. And I thought I was just going to watch, but they included me in, and I just did this whole Greek dance class. It was amazing.
That's amazing.
It was such a gift.
I just want to recognize that feeling that you said about feeling foolish, because that's something that comes up a lot. I think so many people have those moments of like, how could I have felt so foolish is the perfect word. I used to say I felt so stupid, but foolish really is it, because you just believed what was told to you. But the person who told this to you was your parent. And we should believe what our parents tell us, right? That's what we are raised to believe.
Yeah.
Do you feel like he was honest with you about most things? Did he often tell little lies? Or I'm so baffled with why he told you that story.
Yeah, I have no idea. But as I was preparing to go on this trip and trying to gather as much information as I could before I went, I was asking my mom questions, and she doesn't know a lot because this family hasn't been really warm and welcoming to her either. But this nephew has been wonderful to her, and he and his wife are still close to my mom. she said, you could reach out to Evan and he would tell you anything he knows. So I emailed him and he was really gracious to me. He sent me like, here's a whole family tree. These are all the people who I know. His mother was my dad's older sister and she's no longer alive either. She had the most contact with the relatives back in Greece. So in this email exchange, I said, I'm really curious about this story about Papa Marcos and the war and the way he died. And he said, I am so shocked. I've never heard that story. I wonder if it was too painful for my mom to tell me that story. And I thought, something's off there. And the reason he hadn't heard it is because it wasn't true. My parents were the most amazing grandparents to my kids you could ever wish for. And I just think I need forgiveness all the time and I need grace all the time. So how could I possibly withhold it? You just have to be open-handed there, even though it's very difficult. But as I'm talking to my kids about it, this story that Papu's told me my whole life, and my oldest daughter said it well. She goes, Papu was a fantastic storyteller. It was one of his gifts. And my son said, that's kind of on brand. I'm so sorry. I understand. I'm so embarrassed. He goes, it would be natural to be embarrassed, Mom, but that's not a reflection of you. And I have to tell myself, that's not a reflection of me. But
wise words from your son.
Yeah. Yeah.
How did you get to this place? I know faith has been a big part of your journey. How did you get to this place of forgiveness and allowing them to be in your life as your parents from 19 on and grandparents to your kids? How did you emotionally get there?
Yeah, I think I am a writer. And so I started off just writing it in my journal and processing it, writing it. And like you said at the beginning, this is a strange story where people, whenever I've told someone the whole story with all of the wrinkles to it, they always say, oh my goodness, you've got to write a book. And so finally it started taking that shape. And I really felt like it was a great example of coming to a place of a process of healing, because I think it's an ongoing process, and writing that book that might become an example for somebody else and being able to lean into even a hard story and sticking with it and not trying to run away from it, not trying to numb it, not trying to shove it down anymore. And I think it was very shocking to my parents that I was processing all of it because, like I said, I'm always the one who's just putting on a smile and looking like all's well. And it wouldn't be except for probably my husband and my kids who knew how much I was really wrestling with. But the process of writing it was very cathartic. And then I do a lot of research for my job about just rumination and mental health as I advise college students. And I came across a book that talked about, and I do talk to myself out loud, but if you use your own name and shifting into the third person and taking a narrator's perspective is really, really helpful of creating that distance to help you see things more clearly and become less embroiled in them. And I thought that is really what I was doing. That writing process was so helpful. And I made a decision with the book that I wrote to change all of the names and also to fictionalize some pieces of it purposefully so that if anybody in my family was upset by the book, they could easily just say, well, it's fiction. And some of it is. Some of it had to be fiction because there are still gaps that I don't know. And it also protects people.
What is your book called?
Yeah, it's called After the Rotting. And it came from a very poignant conversation with my then toddler daughters, because now they're in their early 30s. We were walking through this apricot orchard, and my daughter at that point, she was like 2.5, and she saw a bunch of rotting apricots on the ground that had fallen from the trees. And she was so upset by the rotting mess. And she was hitting with a stick, and she's like, this is a mess, and I don't like it. And she was just disgusted by it. And I have no idea if this is accurate in terms of like how trees grow. And I'm not an arborist, but I was trying to encourage her. I'm like, listen, you're right. This is a mess. I mean, there's maggots and it was just gross. I was like, but you see this hard part? You see the pit? All of this has to rot away before a new tree can grow. And I just felt like the truth set into me. I just felt like God was saying, yes, this is a hard, ugly, messy process. But you see these two little girls and that little boy sleeping back at home? All of this has to rot away before this new tree can grow. And you can change this legacy, which has kind of been our mission, my husband and mine, because his family is pretty unstable and very messy too. We are going to change this legacy for these three if it's the only thing we do in this life. And of course, it's not perfect. And, we haven't been perfect parents. We didn't get a great toolbox handed to us, but they are stable, wonderful adults. And we're so proud of them that we have this intact, close family.
That's amazing.
And they don't have any surprises coming at them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What advice do you have for a parent who's keeping a DNA surprise from their child?
I think there's no right time to tell them. I think the right time to tell them is today. Because the longer the time goes by, the harder it is for both of you, the deeper the sense of betrayal. And there's no way to avoid that sense of betrayal and that sense of bewilderment. And so the time is as soon as possible.
I like that. The right time to tell is today. What advice do you have for someone who just uncovered a DNA surprise?
I think that there has to be a lot of time and grace and kindness extended first to yourself. And then when you have given yourself the time to process and to catch your breath and to get your feet under you, to ask all of the questions that you have of each person. And I would do it one at a time. I don't think a big group is healthy because I think it would become incredibly overwhelming. And to know that you have a right to ask those questions. And I let a lot of time go by. And there's still questions that I didn't ask my father, and he's passed away now, that I wish I had. Make sure that you have let the time for yourself go and to get the help that you need to be able to write them down and to be able to ask them with curiosity and with grace, because that's what's going to allow you to forgive such that you live at peace.
Traci, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and sharing your story. Every story that I hear is so unique. As I said, this one is definitely stranger than fiction. And it's really inspiring to see how you've moved through that and ended in such a beautiful place with it. Although I know it's a journey that never really ends and it's ongoing. Just thank you. And I wish you the best.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing these stories. I think it's so helpful for each person who's walking their own individual road.
Thanks again to Traci for sharing her story. If you have a DNA surprise that you'd like to share, submit your story at dnasurprises.com. And remember, you can join me over on Patreon for early access to ad-free episodes. Until next time. This episode of DNA Surprises was hosted, produced, and edited by me, Alexis Auersalt. It was mixed and mastered by Josh Auersalt of Siren Recording Studios.